Welcome to the Washington Association of Accounting and Tax Preparers August 26, 2016 Accounting Seminar. This is our second video for this seminar. In this video, we'll talk all about pivot tables. We have 4 amazing examples of pivot tables that we're going to create. And in the process, we will learn everything from beginning to end about how to create pivot tables. Now, if you'd like to download the files and follow along, you got to click on the link below this video and go to the very bottom section, the Other section, and look for the WAAT section. There are 5 files. There are actually 2 videos in this conference. One is about lookup formulas. The other one's about pivot tables. So there's 3 Excel files and 2 PDF notes. Now, before we even start, I want to ask the question, what is a pivot table? We can see one of the end results right here. It looks like we have some products and some regions, and then there is the sum of units in between. Now, I want to go look at the actual data set, because before you can even create a pivot table like this, you have to have a proper data set. I'm going to go over to the sheet Pivot Tables, and here's our data set. Field names at the top are column headers, records in rows, empty cells all the way around, or you can have the actual row headers or column headers. But you can't have data next to your data set. Now notice our data set, these are transactions. So we have date, sales rep, the region, the product sold, the color of the product, number of units, and revenue. Let's go back over to this topic sheet, because the question still is, what is a pivot table? If someone asks you what is a pivot table, it's very simple. That number right there, that is a calculation with conditions or criteria. Now, 102 units total. Can you name how many conditions or criteria went into calculating that 102? Well, let's do it together. It had to go through the data set and find only the product quad. That is the row header, right? Then it had to go through and find only the region south. So far, we only have 2 conditions or criteria. But look at this. Up here, this is called a filter. This filters the entire report. Every one of these numbers is for a product that had the color blue. Not only that, but this is called a slicer. And look at this. We selected one of the sales teams. Colleen, Drew, Kyle, and Shari are all on a sales team. So guess what? That 102 total units was for 7 conditions or criteria. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not only that, but some of the conditions are from and logical tests, and some of them are from or logical tests. If we look over here, the actual calculation for that 102 is, hey, add up all of the products that were quad, and all the regions that were south, and all the colors that were blue, and the sales reps that were either Colleen or Drew or Kyle or Shari. Now, the fact that we're allowed to make some calculations with such complex criteria with such an easy tool called a pivot table is why pivot tables are so amazing. If we tried to do these same calculations with formulas, it would be unbelievably complicated. All right, let's build our first pivot table. We're going to create a cross-tabulated report. And all cross-tabulated means there are some column header criteria and some row header criteria. So it's as if, boom, for that 102, there's a cross. There's the number. Cross-tabulated report, sum of units with 7 conditions or criteria. Let's go over to pivot tables. Now, we have a proper data set, and we can click in any one cell in the data set. If your cursor starts out here, it will not know where the data set is. I click in one single cell. I go up to Insert. And in Tables, I click on Pivot Tables. Now, since pivot tables are so common, we need to learn the keyboard. And it's a succession keyboard. Normally, we do Control-C to copy, and we hold them down at the same time. But Alt keyboards are succession. You hit the Alt key, and then you can notice there's an N. So I let go of the Alt, and now I hit N. And notice there is a V. So then I hit a V. And just like that, it opens up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now I'm going to do that in fast speed, Alt and V. And there it is. Now it guesses right because we have empty cells or column headers and row headers surrounding our data set. The default is on a new worksheet, which is what we're going to do. If we wanted it on this worksheet, we would click Existing Worksheet and pick the location. I want new worksheets, and now I click OK or hit Enter. So really the keyboard is Alt-N-V, Enter. Now I'm going to come down and double-click and name this sheet Product Report and Enter. Now, here is the field list. It's called Pivot Table Fields because these are the column headers, or in database, and we refer to these as fields. Now we can simply drag and drop these fields down to where the criteria goes, columns, filter, or rows. And then we drag fields we want to make calculations upon down to values. Now remember, in our example, in the rows, we wanted products. So this is where we drop products. We simply come up here and click and drag. And instantly, anytime you drag a field down to any of the criteria areas, you will see a unique list of items. That means it actually went through that entire data set and gives us exactly one of each. There are our products. Now we want region down in the columns. And just like that, we have our cross-tabulated form. Now I'm going to drag color down to filters. Now when we drag something down to filters, it doesn't give us a unique list, but it does give us an option to select. This criteria will filter the entire pivot table. Now we come down to units, and I drag units down to values. Now the fact that I'm dragging a number field down to values means the pivot table will default to sum. We can see it says sum of units. Later we'll see how to change the calculation. Now why is it called a pivot table? Here's why. Because once we have our form, if you decide to pivot it, you can click and drag, and I'm going to drag region below product. And now we don't have a cross-tabulated report. We have a vertical report. I'm going to drag this back or pivot it. Now there's a couple things we want to immediately do when we create pivot tables. Row labels and column labels are not helpful labels in a report. If you're going to print this out and give it to someone, it'd be better if this said region and this said product. We can easily change that by going up to Design. In the Layout group, we come to Report Layout. We can either show in outline or tabular. Outline will leave no gray lines inside the pivot table and has a slightly different structure. Tabular will leave the gray lines. And there we have it, region and product. I also want to change the number formatting. Now these are units, so I definitely don't want dollar signs, but I definitely want commas. Now a big mistake that people will make with pivot tables is they will highlight all the cells and right-click Format Cells. If you open up this, I want you to notice how many tabs there are. 6 tabs. This is the normal Format Cells dialog box. We do not want that. The reason why is it will actually format the cells. Remember, pivot tables can pivot. And so these cells might contain number formatting, but when we pivot it, that number formatting will not carry forward. So here's what you do. You click in any one cell in the values area and right-click number formatting. That number formatting option does not occur when you're out in a non-pivot table area. It only shows up in a pivot table. And when I click that, look at that. A single number tab. That is an indication that this is for a pivot table. Notice they call it Format Cells. What they should have called it is number formatting for pivot tables or something like that. Now I'm going to select number, use a comma, and these are units, so I want 0 decimals, and click OK. That's already looking great. Now think about it. We dragged and dropped criteria. We dragged a field down to values where we made a calculation. We made sure to change the report layout so it shows the field names, not column headers. And we added number formatting. That really is the basic of how to build a pivot table. Now one other thing we can do is we can add style. If we come up to Design, there are some built-in styles. And you know, I don't really like any of them. So I'm going to show you how to build your own style, which will remain in your workbook, and you can use it multiple times. I'm going to click on New Pivot Table Style. Now over here we have a list of all the elements we might find in a pivot table. And then we have a Format button. We also have a preview. Now I'm going to start off with whole report. For this whole report, I want black borders on the inside. So I'm going to come down to Format. And on the border, I'm going to select Outline and Inside. I can see I have the inside borders and then the outside. Now I'm going to click OK. We can see our preview starting to emerge over here. Now I'm going to come down to Header Row. This will be this up here. Format. And I would like to have a dark blue fill at the top. If I'm going to have a dark fill, then I definitely want a light colored font. You always want the value difference between font and fill to be as large as possible. Now I'm also going to come over to border, because up here I do not want the actual inside lines. So I'm going to say none. That removes it all. And then outline. That outline means that it will only be around the outside edges. Now I click OK. I'd like to do something to the very bottom row. So the grand total row, that will be this right here. I'm going to click Format. How about we add some borders? I'm going to add a medium line for the top. So that'll be that line right there. And then a double line for the bottom. Now I'm going to come over to Font, and I want to make this bold. Now I can click OK. Now, one thing nice about this is we can come back and edit later. Notice there's also set as default pivot table styles for this document. I'm going to click OK. Hey, wait a second, it didn't happen. Well, now I can come up and go Design, click the More button, and there it is. So now I've applied my style. Now, if I look up here, I see that I forgot the filter area. So I'm going to come back up to Design and come up to this Pivot Table Style and right-click Modify. First off, I would like to give it a good name. I'm going to call this Blue Pivot. And now I want Report Filter Labels. Click Format. I want the same font color white, the same fill dark blue, and the same borders none, and then outline. Now I can click OK. So I've edited two things, Report Filter Labels and the name. Click OK. And there I have my format. Now, before we add the slicer to add conditions off to the side, I actually want to show you a trick. And I'm going to go back over to the topic sheet, because actually this is example number 2. And it's how to create many pivots from a single click. Let's go back over to product report sheet. Now notice we added this color criteria to the filter area. And if I click the drop down, we can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 different colors. If I would like one pivot table for each one of these conditions or criteria, I can click a single button, and instantly down here it will add 5 new sheets with 5 new pivots, keeping the original one that says all. Now, in order for this to work, you have to have all selected. Then you come up to Analyze, over to Pivot Table, and here's the Options drop-down. And there it is, Show Report Filter Pages. Now, when I click this, it's going to ask me which one of the conditions. We only have one, so it's already selected. When I click OK, instantly down here, there'll be 5 new pivot tables. When I click OK, just like that. Blue, I can see it right there. Clear, I can see it right there. Purple, rainbow, and red. That is pretty amazing. Now let's come back over to our product report sheet. I'm going to change the criteria up here to blue. Now notice as soon as I click blue here, every single number in this table has the condition blue. And that's different than the quad in the south. That 246 is only product equals quad and region equals south. When I click right here, it's quad and Midwest. But both of these have the criteria blue applied. So all the numbers have blue. Now, we need to add our slicer that gives us the ability to select multiple sales rep. Now, actually, You can, and later in our later pivot table, we can actually, instead of having the filter and having to mess around with this dropdown, we could add color as a slicer. But in order to get that trick to work here, we needed to have that in the filter area. Now, one last thing before we add the slicer, I would like to name the pivot table. Right-click and Pivot Table Options. Anytime you want something universal to apply, you might look through this dialog box. Things like auto fit column widths on updates. Sometimes if you're pivoting it a lot, the column widths change a lot, so that's a good one to change. But here, we want to come up here and name this pivot table. I'm going to call this Product Pivot 01. Now, normally, if you just have a single pivot table, you don't really need to name them. But later, when we start having multiple pivot tables and multiple slicers, it's really helpful to have a pivot table name. I'm going to click OK. Now, how do we add a slicer? Now, this is a filter that filters the whole report. If we go up to Analyze, the filter group has our slicer, because a slicer is just a fancy visual filter for our entire report. So I'm going to click Insert Slicer. Here is our option. It's all the fields. All I want is sales rep. When I click OK, just like that, I'm given a slicer. Now notice there's these context-sensitive ribbons. Wherever we're clicking, we have context-sensitive ribbons. So I'm going to select the slicer and then go up to Options. I would like to add 2 columns. Now I can come over to the corner and widen it a bit. Drag it down, and you can size it however you'd like. And I'm going to try to add some color to this. Slicer Options, More button, and I'm going to select this color. And now I'm going to click Colleen, and instantly the entire report is filtered for just that one sales rep. Right now, there is 1, 2, 3, and 4 conditions for each one of the cells in our pivot table. If I want to also select Drew, I can hold the Control key, and now it's Colleen or Drew. Now we're using an OR logical test because these 2 conditions are coming from the same column here. I want to also add Kyle, so I'm holding Control and Shari. And just like that, there is that 102. That is the sum of units with 7 conditions: quad, and south, and blue, and Colleen, or Drew, or Kyle, or Shari. Now there is our finished first product. You know, I should have created this as the same blue to be consistent. So I'm going to click here, go up to Design, right-click, Modify, down to Header Row, Format, Fill, and I'm going to select this blue right here. Click OK. Report Filter Labels, Format, and select that same blue. Click OK, click OK, and that looks a little bit better. All right. Let's go back to our topic sheet because we want to look at our pivot table number 3 that we're going to create. Now, this one's going to be amazing. We're going to have 2 different pivot tables with 2 slicers, and we'll connect both of the slicers to both of the tables. And in this products report, we're going to have total revenue. Then we're going to count. Then we're going to calculate the average. So we'll have 3 different calculations for each one of our row header conditions or criteria. Then we're going to see how to group by month. We'll take individual daily transactions and roll them up into total revenue for each one of the months, and a percentage of total calculation for each one of our months. All right, let's go back over to Pivot Tables. I'm going to make sure I have a single cell selected. And we want our pivot table on a new sheet, so I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V, Enter. And just like that, there is a new sheet with a pivot table. I'm going to double-click and call this 2 Pivots Report, and Enter. Now, our first pivot table will be based on the product. So I'm going to drag the product field down to the rows. Instantly, we get a unique list. Now, remember, we needed to sum the revenue, count the transactions, and calculate the average on revenue. So I'm going to drag revenue down to values. Now, because that's a number field, notice it defaulted to sum. If I drag product, which is a text field, watch what happens. I'm dragging this down to the values. It will default to count. Now, it actually doesn't matter which one of these fields that we drag down here if we want to count, because what it's really counting is how many Bellens were sold. So even though there's lots of columns, counting will always count whatever the criteria is in the row, column, slicer, and filter area. Now, I have a third column, and I want that to be a calculation on revenue, so I'm going to drag it down to values. Notice we have three fields down here, sum of revenue, count, and sum of revenue 2. Now, we're going to actually have to, for each one of these fields and each one of these calculations, either change the number formatting, whatever the name is at the top, and the calculation. So we'll start with sum of revenue. Now, this one's already fine. It says sum of revenue. It has the right calculation, so I'm simply going to right-click and change the number formatting. Now, I'm actually going to not include, even though that's a dollar amount, I'm going to indicate the dollar amount with the name at the top. So I'm going to use number, comma, and I don't think I really want to see the pennies for this particular column, so I'll put decimals, 0. Click OK. Now, I'd like to change the title and indicate that these are in dollars, so I'm going to simply type. And in parentheses, I will indicate the dollar. So that is the unit. Now, I'm going to come over to the second column, right-click, number formatting. I'm going to do something similar. Yes, I'm using numbers, but this is not dollar amount. So at the top, I'm simply going to type count transactions and enter. I won't indicate that there's a dollar unit. Finally, this column. Now we have to change the title at the top, the actual calculation, and the number formatting. So when you have all three, sometimes it's easier to right-click and go down to the one-stop shopping value field setting. So when I click that, here's the one-stop shopping. I can change the calculation. There's 11 different aggregate calculations here. I'm going to change it to average. I'm going to come up here and type, and I'm going to indicate the dollar sign here up at the top. This will appear at the top. And now look at this. There's our number formatting. So now I can come over and say number, use a separator, and this is going to be an average, so I definitely want to see 2 decimal places. Click OK. Click OK, and then all three things have taken effect. Now I want to get rid of that row labels and add gray lines. So I go up to Design, Layout, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Click off to the side, and that's our first pivot table. I want a second pivot table right here. So I'm going to go back over to the sheet with a single cell. I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V. And now I'm going to say Existing Worksheet, and then select the location. There's my collapse button, so I can put it anywhere. I'm going to click on this 2 pivots report. I can see the sheet name right there. And then I'm going to click in F3, click OK. Now, we're using Excel 2013 here. So watch what happens when we drag date down to rows. Instantly, we get a unique list. Now, if I drag revenue down to values, that would be great. That would be the daily sales. But I want monthly sales. So there's a great feature called the grouping feature. Now, if you're using Excel 2016 or later, actually, when you drag a date down to rows, it automatically groups into months and years. But in earlier versions, you have to right-click somewhere in the date field in the pivot table and point to group. Now it'll ask us how we want to group. We have dates, so I want months, and I'm definitely using years. We can see we have multiple years here. Sometimes if you have times, like from internet sales, maybe you want to group by hour or minutes. Now I click OK, and just like that, when I drag revenue down to values, instantly I get the total amounts for each month in each year. Now, if we look down here, it says years and date. So the years field is also up here. But notice that the date actually represents the field for our months. Now I'm going to drag the year off. And when you remove a field, you can actually drag it anywhere, because we're going to add a slicer for the year. Now let's fix that row labels, Design, Report Layout, and I'm going to say in Tabular. Right-click, Number Formatting. And we're going to do something similar. Number, comma, no decimals, click OK. And I'm going to call this and indicate the dollar sign. So there is the total for each month. But those are both years. That's not what we want. We'll get to the slicer in just a moment. We have another calculation we want to make here. So I'm going to drag revenue down to values. Now, whereas in this column here and these three columns, we used aggregate functions to make some calculation. We actually want to make a calculation that's the percentage of each one of these of the column total. So I'm going to come up and right-click. Now, if we summarize values by, we get our aggregate functions. But now if we do show values as, there's a bunch of amazing calculations. Percent of grand total, percent of column total. Now, in our case, these would both be the same because we don't have a cross-tabulated table. Percent of row, difference, that's the change from period to period, percent difference, running total, all sorts of amazing calculations. I'm going to say percent of grand total. And just like that, it calculated the percent of grand total. I'll change the title at the top, percent of revenue total, and enter. Now we need to add a slicer. So I come up to Analyze, Filter Group, and there is Insert Slicer. Now I want two slicers. I'm going to select Color and Years. Click OK. Now I want to add some rows above the pivot table. So I'm going to highlight 1, 2, 3, 4 rows and right-click Insert. Because I've highlighted the rows, not the cells, when I right-click Insert, it will know to insert those extra rows. Now I'm going to bring the slicer up here and try and resize it. First, let's change columns to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I can resize it. I'll bring years up here. Options. Now, notice I changed it to 2 columns here, and I see some ghosts that I don't really want. So here's a great trick. Right-click, Slicer Settings. And we can say Hide Items with No Data. Click OK. Now I can resize this. Now, if we want to make both of these slicers the same height and size, we can come over here, and I'm going to notice the height is 0.68. So I'm going to come over to the other slice, and height, I'm going to say 0.68, and enter. So now they're both the same height. Now using the Control key, I'm going to select both of them, come up to Options, Align Top. Now I'm going to add with them both selected the same color. So up to Options, and I'm going to select that color. So there we go. Now we have a couple things we want to do to the pivot table. I want to select one of the pivot tables, go up to Design, and there's the More button, and there's our custom format we made in our first pivot table. Click in the second pivot table, Design, the More button, and there is our custom style. Now let's just see what happens if I slice these. If I select blue, watch this. When I select blue, it's governing the monthly report here, but not the product report. If I come over here and select 2015, yes, it's governing this pivot, but not this one. Now, before I connect these both to both pivot tables, let's name each pivot table. Right-click, Pivot Table Options, and I'm going to call this Product Pivot 02. Click OK. Right-click, Pivot Table Options, and I'm going to name this Monthly Pivot, and enter. Now I can come up to the slicer, right-click, and there it is, Report Connections. And you can see there are a bunch of pivot tables here. Luckily, we named them. I'm going to say Product Pivot 2. That's the one we want selected, and click OK. Right-click, Report Connections. Same thing. We'll connect it to both of our pivots. Click OK. And now when I select red, all the numbers change. When I select 2016, just like that. Blue, 2015. That is pretty amazing. So we created this pivot for products with 1, 2, 3 aggregate calculations. Over here, we grouped by month, got the total for each month, and then did a show values as calculation, percent of total. And then we connected both pivots to both slicers. All right, we have one last pivot table report we want to create, and it's actually going to do a couple other show values as calculation. Let's go over to topics, and here's our fourth report. We're going to group by month. Then we want to see the total, the running total, the cumulative percent or percent running total, the amount of the change, and the percentage change, and then connect it to two slicers. So let's go back over to Pivot Tables. I have a single cell select. I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V and Enter. Here is our field list. Date down to rows. And look what happens. Every time we build a pivot, it's going off the same cached source of data. So it remembers that we grouped by month. Now, all of the calculations are going to be on the revenue field. So I'm going to actually have to drag the revenue field 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 times. We're not going to need this field list anymore, so I close it. I'm going to get rid of the row labels, design, report layout, show in tabular. One at a time, we will change each one of the calculations. This one already has our sum, so I'm simply going to go to number formatting. Number, comma, 0 decimals, click OK. We'll call this total revenue in dollar. And I'm actually going to do the amount of the change. It's more appropriate that's right here next to the amount so we can see the actual amounts and the amount of the change, then the percentage change, then the running totals. Right click, show values as, and I want difference from. It's going to ask us two questions. What's the base field? Well, it's date. And sometimes we like to see the amount of difference from a base period like January, but that's not what I want. I want to say from previous. When I click OK, just like that, we can see the difference between January and February with minus down 4,870. Now I'm going to add some number formatting. Right click, number formatting. Number, comma, 0 decimals, click OK. And I think I'll change the title up here. Change and indicate the unit. Right click, show values as, and we come down to percent difference from. Date, and I want previous. Click OK. Look at that. It already has the number formatting. I'll come up here, percent change, and enter. That's pretty amazing that we can do those two calculations so quickly in a pivot table. Now let's do running total. Right click, show values as, and there is running total in, and it's going to ask us what? Well, we only have one criteria off to the side here. So date is fine. Click OK. Right click, number formatting, comma, 0 decimals, click OK. And I'll indicate the label, running total, and enter. So we can see as we're accumulating, the very last period is the same as our grand total. Come over to the last column, right click, show values as, percent running total in. Date is fine, click OK. So as we're moving forward, we can look all the way through November. Cumulative, we had 63.39% of the revenues. Of course, the last category is 100%. Change the label, percent running total. Sometimes this is the percent cumulative total, and enter. Come up to design, more button, and there's our custom style. Right click, pivot table options, and I'm going to call this monthly pivot 02 and enter. Now I want to add two slicers, analyze, insert slicer. We're going to do color and year. Click OK. Bring the years right over here. We'll say two columns. Right click, slicer settings, and I'm going to hide items with no data. Resize this. Come down here. Select both of them at the same time. Options, more button, and I'm going to select that color. Now I can select 2016 blue, and there it is, the total for each month, the amount of the change, percentage change, running total, and percent running total. That is the power of pivot tables. Wow, we saw a lot about how to create pivot tables and how easy it is to create calculations with conditions and criteria. We saw how to do the pivot table and the slicers, how to do multiple calculations, both aggregate and these awesome show values as calculations. Back here on 2 pivots, we did 2 different pivots with a series of calculations, including multiple slicers, and connected both pivot tables to both slicers. And then over here on product report, our first pivot table, which illustrates the true meaning of what a pivot table is. For each calculation in the pivot table, it's a calculations with 1 or more conditions. In this case, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 calculations. All right, that was a lot of fun at the WAAT August 26, 2016 accounting seminar. This video we did pivot tables. The last video we did lookup formulas. All right, we'll see you next seminar.